If you work in a hospital without mirrors, run. I was never one to believe in the supernatural. I always relied on science and empirical data as my guides, especially in my work. I've been a nurse for about 5 years, and I've faced difficult situations, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at St. Agnes Hospital, where I worked about 3 months ago. St. Agnes was a relic of the past, an old hospital in a forgotten part of the city where time seemed to have stopped. I didn't have many job options at the time, and had some debts to pay, so I accepted the offer to work the night shift. The pay was good, and the work seemed straightforward. I expected just a few uneventful nights, but on my first day, I realized that something was wrong. First of all, as I mentioned, it was a very old hospital, originally built as a kind of sanatorium for people with a rare dermatological condition known as Eagle syndrome. It's a little-known disease that requires an adapted lifestyle, including very low exposure to light. Because of this, the hospital had an oppressive atmosphere. The hallways were long, dark, and the lights flickered constantly. The decor, too, was eerie. Wooden panels showing signs of age, and portraits of the hospital's founders and the early staff that seemed straight out of a horror movie. It seemed almost as if their eyes followed you as you walked by. There was, of course, an absolute silence, broken only by the distant hum of some medical equipment. It felt like the building itself were alive, breathing in unison with its inhabitants. My first night was quiet, but I felt an inexplicable unease. There was something in the corridors, something I couldn't identify, but I knew it was there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger that feeling became. Eventually, I distracted myself by organizing some supplies, convincing myself that it was just my mind adjusting to the night shift world. The only thing that really caught my attention was when I used the bathroom. I finished what I had to do and washed my hands, but when I went to check my reflection, there was no mirror. In the bathroom, in the corridors, in the nurse's station, there wasn't a single mirror anywhere. I knew this was unusual, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I let it go. I just mentioned it to another nurse. "Oh, it's to avoid scaring the patients. They don't like mirrors much, and sometimes they can reflect light from somewhere." That was enough to convince me. In the second week, I was assigned to care for a particular patient. His condition was pitiful. His appearance was extremely pale, with sunken eyes. He had been rushed into the hospital without identification, and was in a constant state of delirium. His eyes were glazed, and he murmured incomprehensible things, words I couldn't understand, but that caused me a deep sense of discomfort. While checking his vital signs, he suddenly became agitated, grabbing my arm with a strength I didn't expect from someone in his condition. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like he was trying to tell me something important. But all that came out were incoherent whispers. He kept repeating something like "ud" or "ood." I couldn't make it out. Before I could react, he lunged at me, biting my arm with desperate force. I felt a sharp pain, and my immediate reflex was to push him away with all of my strength. He fell back onto the bed, looking exhausted, and I stood there, breathing heavily, holding my now bleeding arm. The on-call doctor appeared soon after, drawn by the noise, but his reaction was strangely apathetic. He looked at the man with a mix of pity and annoyance, as if it were just a mild inconvenience. "He's delirious," the doctor said distantly. "Calm him down with a sedative." I wanted to question him, to say the patient needed more than just a sedative, but something in the doctor's look made me hesitate. I did as he asked, and after sedating the patient, retreated to the nurse's station, trying to push the incident out of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep when I got home. The pain in my arm still throbbed, and the experience lingered in my mind, which was already a mess. But I needed to go back to work the next day. About 3 days later, The atmosphere in the hospital was even heavier. It was as if the air was charged with electricity, almost difficult to breathe. The corridors seemed even darker, and the silence deeper. I felt a constant presence, as if I were being watched. But every time I looked back, there was nothing, just the cold, silent emptiness. During my shift, I decided to check on the patient who had bitten me. When I entered his room, I found him motionless, almost like a corpse. His skin was even paler, and his lips were stained crimson. The monitor next to the bed showed weak but present vital signs. However, what disturbed me the most was a seemingly trivial detail: the reflection on the steel tray I was holding. There was no reflection. The bed was there, the equipment was there, but the patient wasn't. Fear began to form in my stomach, rising to my throat. I tested it again, changing the tray's position, but the result was the same. My mind tried to rationalize it, but my instinct screamed that this was not natural, that I needed to get out of here as soon as possible. I stood in shock for a few seconds, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, a cold hand touched my shoulder. I almost screamed. It was one of the veteran nurses with a neutral expression on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked casually. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. I didn't know what to say, or if I should say anything at all. Everything felt so surreal. It was as if I were trapped in some kind of nightmare. I decided to leave the room and continue my shift, trying to distract myself with the usual tasks, but the fear persisted, gnawing at me whenever I picked up a tray. Later that night, while walking through the empty corridors, I heard voices. I followed the sound, finding a dimly lit room where a group of doctors and nurses were speaking in low voices. They had their backs to me, and I hid behind a slightly open door, listening. The words I heard chilled me to the bone. They were talking about me. They discussed how he had chosen the next victim and that I was being prepared. One of the doctors mentioned that the patient who bit me was an indicator, someone being used to test who was ready for the process. My heart raced. They were planning something for me, and it certainly didn't seem good. Before I could leave, a dark shadow passed by the door crack, and I felt a cold presence behind me. I didn't need to look to know that it was the patient, the man who had no reflection. His breathing was heavy, and he whispered my name, as if he knew me intimately. Fear took over, and all I could do was run. I ran through the corridors, feeling that presence growing closer. The hospital seemed to transform as I ran, the corridors lengthening, the lights flickering, and the doors that had been opened now slammed shut in front of me. It was as if the building itself was conspiring to keep me inside. Finally, I found a supply room and locked myself in, trying to control my breathing and the pounding of my heart, which felt like it was about to explode. On the other side of the door, I could hear his breathing, feel his presence, and the sound of nails scratching the wood terrified me. "I know you're in there, sweetheart," his voice whispered, almost like a sweet lover's but laced with malice. "You don't have to be afraid. It will all be over soon." I needed to get out of here before it was too late. In a final act of pure desperation, I flung the door open and shoved a shelf full of glass jars, which crashed to the floor, creating a loud noise. The man, besides getting cut by the shards, seemed to shrink from the noise. I took advantage of the distraction and ran through the hospital's back exit. I didn't stop until I reached home, exhausted, but alive. The next day, I resigned over the phone. I couldn't explain the reason to my superiors, just that I couldn't work there anymore. They didn't push, and I was relieved. In the following weeks, I tried to forget what happened, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at my reflection, something was different. I've slowly noticed that I'm becoming paler. Yesterday, when I tried to go out during the day, I had a heat stroke. It was quite mild outside. I fainted and was taken to the hospital, where the doctor told me that I have Eagle syndrome, or as it's known in the country of its origin, Orlock syndrome. He suggested I stay at St. Agnes Hospital, since it's a reference on the subject. I'm afraid of what might happen if I go there. Either way, if you ever work at a hospital without mirrors, run.